I'm Frank Couvares, professor of history here at Amherst, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel discussion. It's associated with the Campus Challenge, which you've all, I'm sure, heard about now, which has a number of events going on for weeks and weeks. Among them, the current drive to fill that truck out there by Valentine with food. And food's being collected all over the place. You've seen the piles in Valentine and Frost Library and various buildings, so we urge you all to do that. But this, I think there needs to be no complicated justification for helping people in immediate need, especially food need. Amelioration of immediate suffering is, for many of us, seems an obvious moral compulsion. But we're here tonight to talk about more structural or broader questions about poverty and hunger in the United States. In the future, in a month, we're going to do a similar panel on poverty and hunger around the world with other speakers. But questions about why there are so many poor people and what might be done about it, what structural issues might be addressed, how we might solve these problems. Those are the questions we want to address tonight from a variety of angles. What are the causes of extreme poverty, the kind of extreme poverty that produces nutritional deficits, hunger, and what do we do about it? So that's why we're here. So let me introduce the people who are going to prime the pump, as it were, to get our conversation going. Walter Nicholson, professor of economics, author of a textbook on microeconomics that has taught generations of students their subject, and also, as you will hear, someone who back in the 60s and 70s worked for the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is one of the prime war on poverty agencies seeking to figure out why there were so many poor people, where they were, and what to do about it. So both theoretical and practical experience. And Kristen Bumiller, whose work has been all about the intersection of race and gender and discrimination and poverty and violence. So a number of perspectives that may help us to begin a complicated conversation about what we can do. Besides, and again, no complicated rationale is needed, besides relieving immediate hunger, helping people who are hungry, giving them food, what we can do in the longer term in a deeper and broader way. So let me start by asking Walter to comment.
So Frank has already stolen my thunder by saying that I'm the oldest person in the room. I'm not really the oldest person. Jay is older than I am, but I'm nearly the oldest person in the room. And my experience with this subject, I guess, dates back a long time. When I was a graduate student in the mid-'60s, I took a job for a year, a little more than a year, in Washington for the Office of Economic Opportunity. I was one of the original poverty warriors. The Office of Economic Opportunity had just been set up shortly after the death of President Kennedy. And in fact, my boss was Sergeant Shriver. And I find many students these days do not know who Sergeant Shriver is. I've given Prakash a lesson on Kennedy-ama, so you can then know who Sergeant Shriver is. Sergeant Shriver was the brother-in-law of John and Robert and all the other Kennedys. He was married to Eunice Shriver Kennedy, who then was the mother of, what's her name? Maria Shriver Kennedy. Maria Shriver Schwarzenegger, who is no longer Mrs. Schwarzenegger, I don't think. At any rate.
He was also George McGovern's running mate in 1972.
Who, Arnold Schwarzenegger?
No.
I'm just kidding. Really? Is that right? I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten. At any rate, so it was a heady time. It was fun to be part of this organization, which was brand new and had only maybe 3 or 4 staff economists and 4 research assistants, which I was essentially. And we were set tasks of doing various things, mainly to try to figure out what we could say about poverty in the United States. And the research was pretty underdeveloped at the time. Most of the impetus to do research came from Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, which really was extremely influential in getting people to think about poverty and think about some of the issues. But some of the tasks I specifically worked on was just attempting to measure the number of poor people and how it varied by ethnicity or marital status or by region of the country. And the definition had just been developed by Molly Orshansky in the mid-50s. And we tried to apply it and figure out who was poor and who wasn't. And so that was the big part of the job. Another part of the job was to see how poverty related to the economy. And we came up with a rule of thumb, which still seems to be true, that each 1 percentage point of the unemployment rate raised the poverty rate by about 1 percentage point. So that's useful to keep in mind in today's environment, for example. The final thing that we did was we set the stage for program evaluation. In the late 50s, Alice Rivlin had written the book Systematic Thinking for Social Action, which was a very influential book in terms of arguing the need for evaluating social programs and thinking about whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. And so we were all taken by Rivlin's book, and we put in place a variety of schemes for thinking about how to evaluate the various programs that were being proposed or in effect. The most important one of which was a project that I was involved in by a lot and really thought it was a tremendous project, although it ultimately went nowhere, which was a project, an experiment of guaranteed annual income in America. And we actually guaranteed people an annual income for a 5-year period and observed their behavior. It was an experiment which was originally done in New Jersey and then was duplicated in Seattle and Denver and in Gary, Indiana, and in rural areas of North Carolina. And so that's one of the most interesting experimental projects that's ever been undertaken in the United States. It was the first of many social experiments which now are regarded as a key way of gathering social research. In any case, we found that about 16% of the population was poor, and we also calculated something called the income gap, the poverty income gap, which we estimated about $12 billion was the income shortfall of people between what they actually had and what they would have needed to get to the poverty line. Now, the poverty line wasn't a generous line, but it just gives you a feeling for what the numbers were. Okay, I want to jump ahead now 45 years to today, and pose a paradox, and then I'll try to address the paradox a little bit, but not much. I hope we'll discuss it more. The paradox is that we have spent, over the last 45 years, somewhere between $100 and $300 billion a year on means-tested programs. And means-tested programs are programs that are programs where they're explicitly oriented toward low-income people, like Medicaid, food stamps, what's called TANF, used to be called welfare, is now called AFDC, now it's called TANF, but a variety of other programs, women, infants, and children, you could just name them, variety. We've spent a lot of money on anti-poverty programs. And the fraction in poverty, which we originally estimated at about 16% of the population, according to the numbers just released a few weeks ago, is 16% of the population. So the paradox is, how could we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on anti-poverty programs and still have the same fraction of the population in poverty? Now, that number's a little misleading because we are currently in a recession. When we started our study, the mid-60s, the economy was in pretty good shape. And so if I take my rule of thumb that each percentage point of the unemployment rate leads to a percentage point of poverty, and we'd say, what would the poverty rate be like now if we were at more full employment? So we're at 9% unemployment now. Suppose we were at 5. That's 4% difference. So the poverty rate might be 12% now instead of 16, something like that. 12% is a pretty reasonable number during the 70s. So I'm sorry, during the 90s was about the number. So we've done a little bit. We've made some progress. But for the amount of money we've spent, we sure haven't made much progress. We've spent a lot of money and very little progress. To put it another way, the current poverty income gap, here, I think this is a really interesting statistic. The current poverty income gap is $81 billion. That is, if every low-income person below the poverty line were given enough money to bring them up to the poverty line, it would cost $81 billion to do that in the United States. We currently spend $300 billion on means-tested programs. So we just have to take basically a quarter of that money and just give it to people. They'd all be brought up to the poverty line. Now, whether that would eliminate poverty, who knows? Whether it would. It's all a matter of definition. But at least it questions what's been going on. So I want to just talk very quickly about program evaluation and then turn it over to anybody who wants to think about this. But so people have tried to evaluate almost all the anti-poverty programs that are in existence, and it comes up a mixed bag, very much. Let me talk about 2 successes and then 2 failures. And then the successes, sort of the unqualified success is Medicaid. Medicaid, by almost universal agreement, is a very important program in terms of improving the health status of low-income people. We spend a lot of money on Medicaid. We spend $150 billion a year or something like that. We spend a lot of money, but it's generally a good program. It really increases increases the health status of low-income children. It reduces infant mortality. It has a lot of good things. So it's a good program. Now, whether it's run as most efficiently as it can be, who knows? But at least it does a lot of good. The second program I want to mention is one nobody has ever heard of, probably, but is the second. We could do a quiz. What is the second largest means-tested program in the United States? The first largest is Medicaid. What is the second largest means-tested program in the United States? Unless you came to the talk last time. Anybody have any? Want to make a guess?
Head Start.
Head Start. No, Head Start's tiny. SSI is pretty big, but it's not anywhere near. Okay, the second biggest means-tested program in the United States is, in fact, the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a very interesting feature of the U.S. tax laws, which calculates your income tax you owe and then gives you a credit for your income. So suppose you owe $5,000, you get a $4,000 credit, and so you owe $1,000. However, suppose you owe $2,000. The Earned Income Tax Credit gives you a $4,000 credit and therefore owes you $2,000 and gives you a check for $2,000. So it's a refundable tax credit that currently spends something like $70 billion a year on grants to low-income people. What's nice about the Earned Income Tax Credit, 2 things are nice about it. One, it's administratively simple to operate. It's done through the Internal Revenue Service. Very nice program. It's oriented toward children, primarily, families with children, so it helps child poverty. And it gives individuals the freedom to spend the money the way they want, rather than the whole mirage of programs we have of public housing or food stamps or all sorts of other in-kind programs. It's a nice program. It's very much along the lines of what I originally worked on, the negative income tax. The negative income tax experiments were intended to see if we could have a program in the United States that provided income to low-income people, kind of with no strings attached, and was more efficient than the current welfare system, which had all sorts of bad incentives in it. At any rate, the Earned Income Tax Credit is a great boon, I think. Let me talk about 2 failures and then call it quits. Failures. The most well-documented failure in terms of low-income programs, low-income programs aimed at providing education and training to low-income people, job training. Almost no one has ever found a job training program that works. So we spend a lot of money on job training programs. We don't spend as much as many other countries do. So maybe if we spent more, it would work better. But in any case, job training programs have been a massive failure across all sorts of different names for them. And I think there's 57 different federal job training programs, many of which are oriented toward low-income people. It's too bad that the job training programs don't work, because they're the answer to one of the primary reasons poverty rate hasn't declined. The reason the poverty rate hasn't declined is because the wage distribution in the United States over the last 40 years has been pulling apart. The high wage people getting higher, low wage people getting lower wages, or at least not increasing their wages. And the wage distribution pulling apart has been a major retarding influence on poverty. So that then leads to my second failure. The second failure isn't a means-tested program. The second failure is the U.S. education system. The U.S. education system has done very poor job of educating low-income people. And everyone who's looked at it concludes that's true. An interesting recent book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz argue that is the primary reason for the spreading apart of the wages. The spreading apart of wages they argue, is because the supply of trained workers has not kept up with the demand for skilled workers. So the demand for skilled workers has been growing by leaps and bounds over the years because of technology. The supply of skilled workers has not kept up, therefore the wages of skilled workers have risen dramatically, and the wages of unskilled workers have been harmed by all sorts of things, including international trade pressures and lots of stuff. So the bottom line is, according to most observers, the U.S. education system is broken, and nobody knows. I don't think anybody knows how to fix it. In fact, I don't think anybody really knows how to fix any of the poverty programs very well. And so I leave it with this. It's time for other people to think about it and see what programs would work better. In particular, what programs would work better to try to compress the wage distribution more. How to get low skilled wages up. I don't know that we have to get high skilled wages down. I don't know that's a necessity. But getting the low skilled wages up seems like a good plan, and I don't quite know what to do about it. So, at any rate, that's my that's 40 years of anti-poverty research, and I still don't know a thing. Don't know a thing.
Thank you.
Well, as Professor Nicholson was speaking, I was thinking about all the inconsistencies between what I'm going to say and what he said, and a lot of them are on the lines of he's seeing a lot of spending that isn't working, and I'm not seeing enough spending, and so I don't think it's an unusual shift, divergence of opinion in American society today. All my research and teaching focuses on issues of poverty. And I wanted to actually take this occasion to think a little bit about the relationship between poverty and hunger in the United States, and particularly what's distinctive about the way the United States deals with issues relating to hunger. I wanted to start out by saying that hunger is a really powerful word. It expresses acute and painful human condition. It describes what it feels like to experience a lack of nourishment. It emotes a cry for help. It does more than suggest a condition of the body. It can be understood as a general expression of the condition of poverty. To hunger is to long to be respected and a dignified member of society. But most importantly, I think the word hunger suggests a moral imperative, that a basic human need must be addressed. Well, since 2006, the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, doesn't use the word hunger anymore to describe an inadequate food supply for Americans. And it doesn't use this word in their current population survey. It's been replaced because of problems of measurement and definition with the word very low food security. Now, this occurred because the USDA was concerned that the word wasn't conceptually and operationally robust. And the American Academy of Sciences convened a panel that worked for 3 years to replace hunger with very low food security. Now, there was short-term outrage about the official adoption of this euphemism. People in the media, for example, said that Americans know what hunger is. But I think the terminology, or this change of terminology, is indicative of a more general response of the government to hunger. And it's, I think, indicative of a particular American way of seeing the problem of hunger. I want to just give what a kind of quick and dirty historical overview of how government programs have addressed the problem of hunger. So before the Great Depression, the response to hunger was almost exclusively local. Cities and towns developed relief efforts for people they considered down and out. There was little organized relief. Sometimes people would end up in jail because they were hungry. The Great Depression was the first time in which we developed a national response to hunger. Hunger policies were addressed along with a whole range of social policies designed to meet the short-term and long-term needs of the unemployed. But some have argued that our first national food policy was implemented because of the embarrassment of farmers dumping food in order to try to inflate food prices. Then in response to that, why people were starving, the government developed food bank programs that exist today to distribute farm surplus. Then the first extensive hunger programs were developed during the Great Society programs, the era of the OEO, as Professor Nicholson is just talking about. And that's when we developed food stamps and programs to help women with infant children. Those programs are, I think, our most extensive efforts to deal with hunger, and they were integrated into a wide range of poverty programs, and we've just heard about how those poverty programs, some were successful and some were less successful. So then the programs that were developed during the Great Society were cut and restricted as part of 1996 welfare reform, and I'm going to talk about those restrictions in a little bit more in a second. What I think is important to recognize from looking at this brief history is that the United States has never engaged in a concerted effort to end hunger. And though many might assume that the current crisis that we're in, pantries are empty, the rate of food insecurity is increasing dramatically, might be just the cause of the Great Recession that we're experiencing. But I would suggest the recession is just kind of the last blow, rather than an explanation for the current food crisis. I think the crisis comes after 15 years of social policies that have made the vulnerable more vulnerable. And I want to talk about three policies that are leading in that direction. First, just in general, growing inequality that to some extent is related to tax policy, some extent related to less regulation. I won't go over what Professor Nicholson just talked about, but there is this growing inequality mostly due to the gap between the wages of the highest earners and the wages of the lowest earners. There also is just a poverty rate that in 2010 reached 15.1%. So this recession comes after this dramatic period of growing inequality in the United States. Secondly, the Personal Responsibility Act of 1996. That changed the landscape of social welfare. In particular, it focused on a regime in which clients were more increasingly scrutinized for their dependence on social services. And so entitlement to social services to a large degree was replaced with an ethic of promoting personal responsibility. But I think what is really important, I'm not going to go into great detail about the welfare reforms of 1996, but I think what's most important is that those reforms dramatically changed the public perceptions about what are the causes of poverty. It linked poverty to personal failure, a history of depending on the state, and turned attention away from structural causes. And the third trend that is contributing is just a general cutting of social services that are a result of the fiscal crisis of the state. These are social services directed for families, the disabled. They're mostly happening at the state level, and also laying off social services workers who have worked in that sector of the economy. All that contributes to the crisis that we're in today. Now, one thing that I think it's crucial to put things into perspective is that the United States is an outlier in terms of punitive aspects to their social policies regarding the poor. Compared to other Western democracies, there's a greater reliance on market systems and more severe cuts in assistance. And additionally, we have a much higher incarceration rate, which many people see as today's poverty program. And so there's also two really important American peculiarities about how we deal with poverty, especially when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world, that are important to consider. The first is that in the United States, we have no specific goal to eradicate child poverty. Contrast this to the UK, where the coalition government has made a pledge to eradicate child poverty by 2020, and to international policies focused specifically on child poverty. This means, I think, importantly, that we don't focus on things like the food issue that have enormous consequences for inadequate nutrition for child development, and the incapacity for children to learn if they don't have enough to eat. And consequently, the child poverty rate in the United States has increased dramatically from 2002 to 2010. So a focus on child poverty would very much shift the terms of the debate about these issues in the United States. The second is that the United States has never, and shows no sign of, affirming access to food as a human right. This comes from a long tradition in the United States of not having what are called social rights, are not seeing a positive responsibility of the government to address basic human needs. Many other parts of the world are establishing food issues as a basic human right, and that, I don't think, discussion has even begun in the United States. So what I want to suggest now to kind of conclude as an example is to think about what are the consequences of the fact that the United States has never established ending hunger as a policy goal. And I think what has happened is that the government response to hunger is inadequate, but more than inadequate, it is often really inconsistent with the realities of poverty and hunger as they exist in America. And I want to take, for example, the way in which food shortages exist in the current crisis created by the Great Recession. During this crisis, studies have shown that people are very dependent both on government food subsidies and private food assistance programs. People who have looked at who uses food banks have found that many of the people who use food banks are people who are already receiving some kind of government benefits, and they are also people who are the working poor. They still have jobs, but their wages are inadequate to meet their basic needs. So what these studies have found is that the primary people using these resources are not just using emergency relief. They're using it to supplement the inadequacy of government resources. The result is that many of the people using private food banks, both offered by private organizations and by religious organizations, are actually long-term clients of federal food programs. And those programs, as I said, are not meeting their need. But then that creates, I think, an additional problem, is that as long-term recipients, it becomes really important to consider the quality of the food they're receiving and its nutritional value. People who have studied food pantry users have raised concerns about their nutritional intake. Food pantries usually provide food with that are very caloric, that have sufficient calories, but they often don't have sufficient levels of protein, vitamin C, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and a lot of that is because the limited access to meat and fruits and vegetables in food pantries. So part of the problem is a large segment of the people receiving federal funds are now reliant also on these food pantries that are not filling the nutritional needs. But also add to that the larger problem, which is called the hunger-obesity paradox. And that is that the combination of low-quality food, reliance on processed and fast food, lack of availability of fruits and vegetables creates consumptions that leads to obesity and leads to the comorbid health conditions like heart conditions and diabetes. And so in many ways, this haphazard food policy that relies on inadequate government services and inadequate nutritional provisions within food banks is contributing to the overall health problems of people who are poor. So I think what this situation tells us, kind of as our kind of concluding moment, is that given the inadequacy of government service, of course, keep on providing food, as Professor Couvares said. This is absolutely necessary. People will suffer. They won't suffer food insecurity. They'll suffer hunger if that relief is not made available. But also, in addition to filling the trucks, I think we as a country need to realize our responsibility to rethink America's poverty policies in ways that address the complex health, welfare, emotional needs of people who are receiving this aid, and in ways that understand the brutality of life for the most vulnerable in our society.
Sure. I think now what we would like to do is take questions from the audience. I'm happy to prompt questions, but I'd rather it just start from you. We've heard two very interesting and different takes on the causes of hunger and the very great difficulties of addressing solutions to the problems of hunger. So questions, please. Comments, reactions. Yes?
Do you think that the educational system should become a means-tested program, and would that solve problems, or do you think that it needs another approach?
Well, that's yours can be.
Yes, I'm so sorry, yes.
Yeah. Well, that gets into a whole other area of what's wrong with U.S. education. And I don't want to start a large discussion of that issue necessarily, but I think I fully agree with the idea that some kind of means-tested thing for education would be a good idea. And particularly, I hesitate to say the nasty word, vouchers for low-income children that let them take their education money wherever they wanted to. I think it's very depressing that low-income families, when given a chance, almost uniformly vote for voucher programs, and the government often will take them away. Washington, D.C. being the most recent case. So Wisconsin being another case. So yes, I very much think that a means-tested voucher system for low-income children education would be a great idea. Mainly because, now I can be even more controversial, because it would break up the public school monopoly, which I think is one of the major reasons for the shortfall of U.S. education.
I don't really agree with that answer, but that's okay. We don't all have to agree about everything, and I don't have to step in every time I do. So other points or questions? Yeah.
Do you think that giving free food to children or their families does not crowd out food that would be given to them by their parents? So if you give them more food, their parents would give them less from their homes. So then what is the effect of any policy that gives them free food on their nutrition or on their health?
I think people who experience food, limited food, are going to welcome food from any source. I mean, I think the problem is the inadequacy of resources that the parents have to begin with. So I don't think there's a competition between free food and food from the family. I actually, this would connect up with Walter, is that in one of the most successful programs might be the school lunch program.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. Precisely for that reason, that it just regularizes the availability of food with a pretty low bureaucratic encumberment in
Yeah.
how it's distributed.
I don't know of any studies that have ever shown anything but success for programs that supply poor people with food. When you give poor people food, at least in America, maybe it's different in India, but you give poor people food, whether it's through food stamps or school lunch programs, and malnutrition goes down, all sorts of objective measures of distress from inadequate nutrition go down. You take that food away. When Reagan cut the food stamp budget, almost immediately malnutrition among children increased. And when Clinton increased the food stamp budget, malnutrition went down. I mean, it was almost a perfect inverse correlation. You may not agree. I see you shaking your heads, but I don't know.
I'm going to leave it to the expert, but there are studies elsewhere that show us exactly.
Outside of the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Countries
I don't know of
where-
any in the United
I would
States.
say countries where the malnutrition problem is even more severe than the United States.
And what's the dynamic that causes that?
What's the argument?
It's the resources, right?
The argument is that parents have limited amount of resources that they can spend their money, so they have this food budget.
Uh-huh.
And if you give them some food, then they will take out some part of that food budget into other maybe social events. Maybe they'll spend it on a wedding or dowry and things like that. Also, I think giving food directly has another problem which Walter sort of referred to, which is kind of the problem, I guess, of government corruption. So I don't know how much of that is a problem here, but in developing countries, there is more because there's more rigidity, there's more bureaucracy. It is easier for the government to give low quality food to poor families and to charge high from the taxpayer in some sense. So there is sort of a mismatch, and they get sort of the prize in the process.
Let me say a word about the school lunch program and the food stamp program in general. This is related, I think, to this general issue. I have a lot of friends who study the food stamp program, and the food stamp program is a wonderful program. I don't have anything negative to say about it, except the school lunch program. I want to start with the school lunch program. The school lunch program is a wonderful program. The problem with the school lunch program is, as I'm sure you all know, getting the kids to eat what you want them to eat. And every time somebody tries to plan it with more vegetables, so I have friends who do research by going in and looking at the trays and see what children leave uneaten, and it's invariably the most nutritious stuff on them. So there's a problem. I don't know how to answer it, but let me pose the problem now for the food stamp program. The problem with the food stamp issue is should the food stamp program restrict what you can buy with food stamps or not? Should it restrict it to extremely nutritional foods, or is that too paternalistic? And do we want to say, let low-income people spend it any way they want? And I think that's going to be one of the big battles over the next 10 years in food stamps, is trying to focus food stamps in on nutritional food. And whether that ends up being sounding too paternalistic toward the poor or sounds like a good social program. I don't know where I come down on that, really. I just see it coming.
Just following up with that, I mean, there's a lot of talk about educating children about nutrition and in-school nutrition, but what sort of adult programs are there that are working with their parents or working with adults in these low-income areas to teach them about nutrition, sort of the trickle-down theory?
I'm a skeptic about the whole argument that people are inadequately nourished because they're ignorant of nutritional information. I mean, there's some element of that. We're all learning things all the time about what's good for us and what's not good for us. Generally, people are malnourished because they're poor. They can't afford food. The best cure for malnutrition is increased income. If you can get jobs, if you get regular income, people will go and buy food. They may not make the wisest of choices, but generally they nourish themselves. They survive. They increase their calorie intake. And it's a great thing. I think Alice Waters deserved the honorary degree that we gave her. And the work she's doing in public schools to make school lunches more nutritious is a great thing. But by and large, the idea that the reason poor people are poor is because they're ignorant of nutritional facts seems to me to miss the point. There have been poor people all the time who, when they get jobs, they nourish themselves.
But we've heard about poverty and obesity paradox earlier. That would go against your claim in some sense.
No, I don't think so.
There's a difference between extreme malnutrition that gets solved by giving people calories, food, and people who have such sufficient amount of money to buy food, but buy poor food. Those are two different things.
So one question I would ask is, suppose that someone only has $100 a week to feed a family, right? There's one way to feed it, $100 in which you can feed everyone so that the nutrition is balanced. But they may choose not to because they're ignorant about nutritional ways of how to shop these things.
That may be, but generally the reasons that people eat, for example, fast food, is because in poor families there are 2, 3 jobs per person, and running from the job as the janitor to the night guard job, or the job as a domestic in the hotel to the night nurse job, you buy the bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken and you drop it on the table. I mean, that's why people, it's not that if we educate them, they're going to make a better choice. If we give them a job that they can make a living on one job, they're going to have more time at home. Preparing salad is the most time-consuming part of making dinner. Right? I think that obviously we all need better education in a variety of ways, and poor people could use some nutritional information. It doesn't strike me that that's the heart of the problem.
And well, I would also add to that, in the United States, in the poorest communities, there may be the least access to high quality food. It's more expensive. There's more fast food restaurants on every corner. There's less availability of fruits and vegetables. So to put too much emphasis on the choice of the individuals, I think, is to downplay all the structural conditions that limit food choices within the poorest neighborhoods in this country. So I think you have to look at those structural conditions.
But just to play foil, too.
No, sure.
It's not that
That's what we're here for.
agree with you.
Have a conversation.
I do agree that the best solution for hunger is to alleviate poverty. I think that was basically Walter's point earlier on, which is and poverty really is a disease, and hunger is a symptom of the disease in this situation. And I've read a lot of studies of exactly why is it that grocery stores do not operate, or if they do operate in low-income neighborhoods, why they offer food that aren't, for example, fresh produce, or rather the high-starch types of foods in there. There's economic reasons that explain why fast food restaurants also located in these types of areas. But the question ends up becoming is that we do find studies in these situations, is that as an economist, the thing that we always want to think about is, given a certain amount of money, what's the best way we can use that money? So we're not
Sure.
making any comments. And then a lot of what Walter would argue would be things like why we have these things like program evaluation is are we best using these monies?
Oh, I think that's a great thing.
So the
Sure.
asset test that I always have my students get, which is, suppose we have a government program which we're transferring, say, some amount of money, say $100 billion, from the wealthier individuals toward the poor individuals. I have no problem with the money. The question is the program that's being funded with $100 billion doing a better job than simply, literally giving $100 billion from the rich to the poor?
It may not be. I mean,
That's the
as
asset
Walter
test.
said, the negative income tax may be the best idea ever designed to alleviate poverty. Just give poor people money.
But that would be a little depressing about the role of the government, right? Then the government is just basically all the government's role is to play Robin Hood in some sense.
What's wrong with that?
I don't think there is, but I
So,
think.
I mean, but you said it's depressing. What's depressing?
No, in the sense that I always have a higher ideal for the government in the sense that they could do even better than that. That by coordinating a lot of people, either through education or through other programs, that they could do even better than a simple transfer of
But, I mean, there's no one solution. This is such a big problem. We couldn't conceivably come up with one solution, whether it's education or negative income tax. I mean, it's so complicated. There are so many. So we have to have educational programs. I mean, Walter's absolutely right. We have the greatest higher education system in the world and the most abysmal primary and secondary school education system in the world. Why? With pockets of excellence in Shaker Heights and Newton and, Amherst, but it's appalling what we have. So we need to work on that. Obviously, I don't think vouchers is the way to do it, but it doesn't matter. We all can agree we have a terrible system. We have, on the other hand, community colleges, which are incredibly effective and efficient institutions. I would pour billions into community colleges and train workers to run plastic extrusion, digital control technology, and put people to work. I would do all kinds of things, but that's only going to solve one part of the problem. So we have a multiple set of issues here. No one is going to drive out the other.
Let me, in line with that, let me say, what I found to be an amazing statistic in the Golden Cats book on education is that if you measure years of schooling by U.S. people, years of schooling have not increased since 1972. The average years of schooling for the U.S. population has been constant. It grew very rapidly from the 1930s to when many people didn't graduate from high school through the 1970s when high school graduation became pretty much high fractions of people, not universal by any means. But the fact that U.S. education has been, just measured in years, leaving aside quality question, just measured in years has not improved at all for 40 years, is I think an interesting question. I think it says part of the answer is something about junior colleges or some way to get educational attainment up. But the other side of the coin, of course, is educational attainment in almost every other country has grown dramatically. So the rest of the world is not standing still while we're standing still. So junior colleges seem an interesting investment to think about.
Are there any questions from students? No. Okay, Jay.
It used to be that a major issue in this sphere had to do with something called the culture of poverty. And by that was generally meant that there were certain cultural correlates of poverty which caused poverty to persist and sometimes increased its negative consequences. But people have also talked to a lesser extent about the poverty of culture. That is to say that for people who are poverty mired, their culture tends to be affected and a problem in having them get out of those circumstances. And this gets back to an issue that Walter was talking about earlier. You were pleased, Walter, with the earned income tax credit because it gave people money to do with it whatever they want. But there is some speculation now that maybe that's not such a good thing. Maybe people don't know enough. Maybe their culture isn't sufficient to get them to use that money in the best sense.
Yeah.
But there's another issue that Walter also provokes, namely your enthusiasm for educational choice. And I must confess that sometimes I'm persuaded that the best thing to do, which I think has been done in a lot of countries around the world, is to get rid of private education and go public for almost everything, so that there is a mixture of students as well as teaching and learning opportunities, rather than a qualification.
The problem is that's never going to happen.
Well,
The problem is it can never possibly
but
happen.
we're talking
Yeah.
about broader issues here, and I'm just curious where this whole notion of the culture of poverty now stands.
Well, I thought culture of poverty theory was disputed and
Absolutely,
put
it
to
was.
bed as much as possible, except to the degree it's incorporated in 1996 welfare reform. I think that a culture of poverty theory is almost always based on racial stereotypes, is almost always
Or class stereotypes.
and class stereotypes. It's almost always takes away agency from people who are low income and ignores the structural conditions. And I think the resiliency of people when they have opportunities to education, when they gain more income, is evidence in itself that people, when they have more opportunities for a sustainable life, move forward with it. I don't know of any kind of sustainable argument that suggests that people are held back because of their cultural attitudes or cultural beliefs.
It's always a popular view among the privileged. There's a 19th century social observer who said, in the eyes of the wealthy, the poor always look grotesque. And
There certainly is that, there's no
yeah,
question.
and it seems to me if you were to ask people in 19th century New York, in 1890s in New York, about Jews, they would say, on good evidence, first of all, the single largest component of the prostitution trade in New York City was Jewish prostitutes. Jews are very heavily represented among gangsters, and they would have had all sorts of things to say about the people who very soon thereafter became the model minority, just as they would have had unimaginably racist things to say about Chinese, who within a couple of generations became the model minority. There was no cultural gap. What there was poverty. And poverty can create distorted behaviors, it can create criminal behaviors, it can create desperate behaviors.
you
But
don't
that's not a
find the
culture of
argument,
poverty.
Frank, that there are cultural consequences of poverty,
I think there are consequences of poverty.
but not cultural.
Well, I mean, it creates habits, and bad habits can get passed on, but those habits can change with remarkable rapidity.
Absolutely.
Remarkable rapidity
Absolutely.
when you introduce jobs and wealth into a community.
When I first started teaching at Amherst, we had a course called Problems of Inquiry. Well, all of you may be too
Yeah, no,
recent
I remember
Amherst
hearing about
arrivals
it.
to
I
teach.
wasn't here.
You weren't here for it. So I taught I was dragooned into teaching Problems of Inquiry. I was the economist, and the topic for the year was poverty. Believe it or not. So we had a course on poverty, and I was struck, being a newly minted assistant professor, by the fact that, number one, many of my colleagues were captured by this idea of the culture of poverty. I was forced to teach the culture of poverty. I wasn't forced because I poo-pooed it in class. Said, I don't believe any of this. Poverty means absence of income. Give them more money, they'd be fine. And but anyway, I was
Or they'd
forced.
be just as fine or unfine as we are.
Yeah, right.
That same
Yeah,
mix of.
just as many neuroses as everybody. So, but what really surprised me about the culture of poverty was that it was most swallowed by my most liberal colleagues. And here I thought I was a fairly conservative person teaching the poverty course, and I thought, gee, this sounds kind of strange. It sounds almost racist to me, this teaching, and I didn't believe in it at all. But I don't know. At any rate, I think it's died. I hope it's died.
Certainly has that.
There used to, for example, in economics, there used to be a theory that farmers were irrational. And there was a whole debate in the economics profession about the rationality of farmers. And they just were not mired in the past, and they didn't know how to plant stuff, and they were really stupid. And, most economists looked at it and said, that's crazy. And it's been totally disproved. farmers are as smart entrepreneurs as anybody. And so take that sociology stuff and throw it away. Jay is a sociologist, and he and I joke about this all the time.
So both of you said something in your talks that I wonder if you could just expand on. I think, well, you said that we spend 300, I think it was 300 billion a year on various mean tested programs, and the poverty rates stayed the same.
Mhm.
And implication being that, you know, maybe it hasn't done any good to spend all that.
But you qualified that very significantly later, saying that, you know, because unemployment has gone up, the actual
Right.
comparison may be
There
between.
was a difference, but I mean, another option might have been just that if we hadn't spent all that money, it would be much worse.
Mhm.
And then, Kristen, you
Well, we
said-
don't know that for sure.
Well, no, that's what I'm gonna ask, because Kristen, when you said, I think the answer is we haven't spent enough. And so those two positions seem pretty polar, and I'm just wondering if you could
I heard,
give some basis for saying why one of the
I
other.
think I could make him agree with one another by saying we should be spending a lot more on those programs that Walter thinks have worked.
Well,
A lot more.
but
or
Go
I
ahead,
don't know if necessarily the answer is more money on means-tested programs. I mean, I think where we might agree is more money on education, because education has the greatest impact in changing people's lives and future earning potential. And so I wouldn't see all poverty reduction as about transfer of wealth or even through programs, but government policy that focuses on reducing inequality. I mean, it could, you know, be changes in the tax code. It could be regulation of wages. You know, that may have, for me, you know, raising the minimum wage, and I know we could probably get into debate about that, might mean more, have a greater impact for poverty reduction than adding more means-tested programs. So I think the Great Society assumed you could build the program, right, or the interlocking programs, but I think that, you know, in this decade, I think we're gonna have to think more multifaceted ways in which we counteract the growing level of inequality in the United States, because there's lots of factors that I think are producing the growing level of inequality.
I heard Greg Mankiw give a very interesting talk at Princeton about the stimulus package. And he started out with the following analogy. Suppose you're a doctor and someone comes in you with an ailment, you don't know what it is, and you say, well, I'm going to treat you the following way. You give them some pills or something. And 3 weeks later, they come back and they say, thank you, doctor, but I don't feel any better. What do you do if you're the doctor? Do you say, give you more pills? I didn't give you enough. We're going to double the dosage. Or do you say, I'm going to give you a different pill? Because we didn't do it the first. And either one is a reasonable approach, but they're different approaches. So now to tie this to, for example, education. I mean, everybody says education is the answer. I think we all agree that education for low-wage people, better skills for low-wage people is a very important problem. But the question one should ask is that a money problem? Now, real spending per pupil in the United States has almost tripled in the last 30 years. And our educational outcomes haven't improved. So you're in the situation of the doctor. Well, maybe if they had quadrupled in the last 30 years, they would have gotten better, or quintupled, or then again, maybe we're doing something wrong. So anyway, I just leave that as a nice analogy to think about, whether money would solve the problem anywhere, or is you got to think differently. That's why I'm a big fan of the earned income tax credit, because I think
I would go with the full negative income tax.
Yeah, right, I would
There was
too.
one moment in American history, 1972, in the race between Richard Nixon and George McGovern, when both candidates, for a time, we're proposing a negative income tax.
Yeah.
Amazing moment.
The-
It passed.
The Nixon's Family Assistance Program, that's what it was called, the Family Assistance Program, passed the House of Representatives and then failed in the Senate. And I urge any of you who are interested in the history of that program to read Daniel Patrick Moynihan's book, The Politics of a Guaranteed Annual Income.
Moynihan's program.
It was, well, it was Moynihan's idea, but his book is a tour de force of his, he's a wonderful writer anyway, and Moynihan's book is great, describing what happened to Nixon's Family Assistance Program and why it was shot down and who shot it down and under what circumstances. So it's,
More questions, yeah. Well,
I'm not really sure how to phrase this. I think it might be more than one question. So when you were first talking about the different means testing programs, and you were talking about some of them that had worked really well and some of them that had really not worked
Mhm.
well, correct me if I'm not thinking about this right. It seems like some of that lumped together a lot of programs, some of which, like the job training program, are more aimed at fixing structural problems, and some of them, like food stamps, are more aimed at fixing more immediate problems, and those seem to be the ones you described that worked better, like food stamps and,
you know, but I think that may just be accidental.
you think that that's accidental, and why?
Well, I'll give you an
do
example of a
think that-
program that's aimed at fixing a specific problem that has worked very poorly is public housing. Public housing is an absolute disaster. No, some of the voucher aspects of public housing aren't disasters, the rental assistance programs, things like that, but I'm talking about the
public
big,
housing is awful, but the alternative is not condos on the hillside. The alternative is living under the bridge in box. So, I mean, public housing, in fact, gets people out of harm's way, for whom the private housing market has nothing to offer and will not have anything to
But
offer.
why isn't the alternative something like Section 8 housing?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Why isn't the alternative like Section 8 housing, like basically the voucher program that Walter's talking about, which is instead of having to use the government money to live in government housing, the government gives you the money as like a subsidy for the private rental houses, so you can live in the communities that you couldn't afford earlier.
If that works, fine by me. I'm not sure that it would work, but is there evidence that that would work to house a significant number of the homeless or those at the margins of housing security? I mean, it may work for some, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who need
So-
jobs.
so Aubrey, do you have a theory?
For Section
Oh,
8.
I think Aubrey was working toward a theory.
No,
Theory.
I didn't really have a theory about why that distinction might be made.
But, well,
I
you
was
think
just-
you maybe could make the distinction, though, you think,
Well, I was just wondering.
your thesis.
If, I was just wondering, really, rather than if there have been programs aimed more immediately that have gone badly, if there have been programs aimed at fixing structural problems that have worked, where job training hasn't worked, and why you think that program failed so badly? Because it seems like the programs aimed at fixing structural problems are the ones that would lower the poverty rate in the long run.
I think that's really a great question.
It is.
I don't know how to deal with it. I'm a little unclear on what a structural problem, I keep hearing actually, you only use the term structural problem. Could someone tell me what a structural problem is?
Well, I just see a distinction between, say, giving someone food stamps because they need food this week,
Mhm.
but they might keep getting food stamps, and that might not really help alleviate the cause of why they need food stamps. It's giving them food and because they're hungry, but it's not fixing why they can't afford to buy their own food, whereas programs like job training might, in the long run, alleviate the cause of poverty instead of the effects of poverty.
In theory, I mean,
In
that's why
theory.
these
Yeah, but they
job
haven't
training
worked.
programs exist, because people believe they'll work, but the evidence is that they work very poorly in the past. The reason
What-
may be because they're not very well keyed to the actual job market. That could be one answer, I don't know. Do you have evidence or?
I mean, Progressa in Mexico works very well, so that's a conditional cash transfer to households.
And why does it work well? What is
It's
it
a
that
conditional cash transfer, so the government pays money to the households if the mother takes the child for regular health checkups, if the child has a regular attendance at the school.
Oh, that's a great program. But we were talking about job training for example.
No, but she was saying, give me an example of
I
structural
see.
program
That works well.
That works well. So here it combines sort of, the conditionality with sort of some of the structural problems in,
Yeah.
in Mexico or in Latin America.
But a structural problem is, for example, I would say,
Yeah.
we have this enormous problem of the loss of unskilled jobs. Now, there's nothing we can do to reverse it. We're never going to get back those unskilled textile factory jobs that my grandfather and grandmother got when they came over and turned the family into a middle-class family. We're never going to get those back. The paper mills, the coal mines, the steel mills. They're all in India now. They're all in Indonesia now. They're all in Brazil now. So that's the way it is. Never going to turn out. But what do we do with millions of immigrants, especially who come over without much in the way of language skills, without much in the way of skill? They have to do something. What are we going to do? We put them on the dole? Fine by me as a solution to immediate problems. But how do we put them to work? We're not going to educate them to be digital machine technology workers. It's not going to happen. What do we do? How do we put those people to work? I mean, one answer is public works projects that clean the public the bathrooms and work in the national parks to build trails and do CCC type work. I mean, I don't know, but those people have to be attended to. That's a structural issue. Maybe a generation in the future, their children will get educated at community college to run the digital extrusion technology, but they're not going to be. And we've got millions of those. We are net importers, big net importers of poor people.
My sense of what a structural, at least what a structural solution is a solution that alters the structure of the society so that it can itself begin to cure the problems at issue, so that it doesn't require continued stopgap measures from a government, as is required in the case of food programs, as is required in some of the programs we've talked about tonight. But I want to get back to Walter's paradox. It seems to me that there is another way of looking at that paradox, which suggests that you have underestimated the consequences of poverty. That it may be that over time, poverty has become so much more severe, so much more difficult to escape, that it has cost that amount of money every year to stopgap it. It's not that it has not done anything for the poverty-stricken. Quite the contrary, it's done a lot. But it hasn't taken them all the way out of poverty, to be sure.
Well, that's the Mankiw argument,
Yeah.
or the Mankiw, the Mankiw that says, some say the stimulus, the economy would have been so much worse without the stimulus.
Absolutely, and the patient who came in and said the pills didn't work, the patient didn't understand what it meant to
Yeah,
not
right.
work.
The fact he came in 2 weeks from then, meaning the pills did work because he would have been dead otherwise.
That's one way of looking at it.
But I think Aubrey, you may underestimate the importance of human capital programs prior to the current era. So, for example, the increased universal education in the 19th century, or the increasing educational attainment and high school closing on large, not nearly universal, but high levels of high school graduation in the early 20th and mid 20th century. Those were structural solutions that seemed to work in the way I mean, if we go way back.
Yeah, I wasn't saying none of them
Yeah.
worked, I just was wondering if there were some that
Oh, if
worked,
there-
because I didn't know.
Yeah, well,
But structure, if you attack structural problems, you're also going to, change the balance of power. So programs in Great Society like OEO poverty lawyers were eradicated because in some ways they were doing too much, challenging government too much. And so I think one of the questions you need to ask is who's going to push back when you start to make some progress on structural problems.
I can give you one example, and then of one that worked, but it's extreme. So it shows you the kind of extreme things that can happen. I was working on evaluating some job training programs in a nickel mine in Labrador. And they were training Aboriginal workers to come in and from various tribes to work there. And they took 10 of them and taught them to be helicopter pilots. And it cost $180,000 apiece to teach them to be helicopter pilots. And they ended up making $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year for the rest of their lives. So, I mean, I don't know what to make of that except to say there was a case where you spent enough money and taught them enough skills, it worked.
Well, investment, yeah, I mean, if we want to create jobs, investment in infrastructure is the way, and in research and development is the way to go. I mean, from the Erie Canal, I mean, there could have been no great market explosion in the upper Midwest, in the Great Lakes. There would have been no Detroit, no Chicago, no breadbasket if the Erie Canal hadn't been built with public money. It's a public-private consortium in New York State, which allowed the entire Great Lakes region to be connected to the port of New York City, and thereby to the world. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought hundreds of thousands of people, generations of the poorest, they were white poor people, as well as black poor people, into the middle class by electrifying the countryside and making it possible for the market to start working in the Cumberland Valley and the Tennessee Valley. So, and the Second World War, which created radar and petrochemical industry and the modern computer industry, all from government investments. So massive investments in basic research and in huge infrastructure works to generate economic activity, but they're very expensive. And in a war, you can do anything you want practically. You know, you got to beat the Nazis. So you got all the money you want to invest in whatever you say is going to win the war. That's radar, and that's petrochemicals, and that's what you invest in. But how do you get that in peacetime? Those massive investments. It's possible, but it's not easy. Which is quite different, by the way, from investing in specific, in Solyndra, making a bet maybe on the wrong company or the wrong. We're talking about the basic foundations of economic growth.
With regards to, I think, I don't know if this is touching on what you said about structural problems and why they disturb the balance of power and you get pushback. But in the field of poverty studies, is there a resistance toward discussing raising the minimum wage? Because my experience so far in talking to various people who work in homelessness or in poverty or in hunger is that the issue of minimum wage gets so, and raising the minimum wage and whether or not that will affect the economy and how gets so political and gets so many people heated and almost steps outside of the immediate discussion into this huge question of wealth and income distribution and corporations and blah, blah, blah. Do you find, I don't know if my assumption is correct, but do you find that discussing minimum wage and wage distribution is something that is considered a very political, almost scary topic to discuss when you're discussing poverty?
Not scary, but it is very politicized.
But the minimum wage has been extensively studied by, there's certainly nobody has shied away from studying the minimum wage. And the connection between the minimum wage and poverty has been extensively studied. So yeah, there's no reluctance to do that. The general findings on the minimum wage are twofold. I guess number one, that the minimum wage is not as closely connected to poverty as one might think, because most people, a large fraction of people in minimum wage are in fact not from poverty households. So raising the minimum doesn't actually affect too many poverty households. The second question, the more debatable question, is how the minimum wage affects the demand for labor, and that's highly debated, and there are quite large disagreements among economists. And you have some economists who argue it has almost no effect on demand, and others who argue it has big effects. So that's totally unresolved, I think.
Some people argue that it'll benefit teenagers and people who are just entering the labor market and not benefit families. But I think there are other issues about job mobility, a dual economy where there are bad jobs and with very limited mobility, very low wage, possibility to increase wages, to increase responsibility. I think, you know, the debate over the minimum wage has also been replaced to some extent by people who argue for a living wage, who argue that, for example, city and state governments need to set wage levels at a level that will sustain families, given the economic conditions in the particular location that those jobs are at. So I think that is really actively discussed in poverty studies.
Where's the debate? Who is pushing against the idea of living wage, or what's the argument against local living wage system?
I think there's concerns that it will reduce the total number of jobs. I mean, the economists, you know.
The market
it's
sets
just a-
wages, not fiat from the state. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the argument. And if you set wages in ways that the market can't abide, the money will go elsewhere. Find labor that it wants to hire, not labor it's forced to hire at a higher wage. I mean, that's, right?
Yeah, the living wage suggestions are for fairly substantial increases in wages. So whether that's good or bad, it's hard to say, but the current minimum wage, I think, is $7.25 or $7.50, somewhere in that neighborhood. The living wage people talk about is more like $11, $12 an hour. So with $12 an hour, a full-time worker could have his or her family above the poverty line. That's kind of number. $7 an hour is not enough to get above the poverty line if you're trying to support a family on that kind of money. But $12 is, because you work full-time, you'll make about $25,000 a year. So,
The idea
versus
of a living wage has a very checkered past. I mean, in the past, a living wage meant a man's wage adequate to support a family with mommy at home, raising the children. And the labor movement fought for a living wage for years. You know, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours for what we will, and on that 8 hours earnings, ability to support a family in a decent lifestyle. You know, that's what that, and a man should have that capacity. Ironically, by the 60s and 70s, certainly by the 70s and 80s, it's no longer possible to support that sort of lower middle, upper working class style of life without two incomes. It's mommy and daddy now have to go to work to support the family, partly because expenses have increased, needs, demands have increased for a variety of things, but partly simply because wages are stagnating. So now the living wage is attainable, but only with two wage earners. So the idea that women are now equally empowered to work in the workplace is a great thing, except they're usually working to support part of a family's need, rather than in the old living wage, one person was supplying the family. And I
Though-
have that too.
Also, I mean, it hasn't played into the discussion, but the substantial percentage of people in poverty are women with children.
Yeah.
So it's a one wage earning
So
family.
one wage earner.
by the way, just to make my pitch for the alternative, for the earned income tax credit one more time.
Go to it.
Last week, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a new measure of poverty in the United States. And I urge you all to read it. It's very interesting. It has some interesting conceptual questions. But they had this massive panel to redefine all the concepts and everything. It didn't change the percentage at all. So, and maybe that was a political decision. But it changed the composition dramatically of the poor.
And poor looks darker and more female now, right?
Well, the main thing it changed was it reduced substantially the number of children in poverty.
Oh, it did?
And the reason it did that was because of the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit, they estimate, was responsible for like a 3 to 4% percentage point reduction in the number of children in poverty. And it increased dramatically the number of elderly poor. That all has to do with the way they dealt with medical expenses. It turns out there are a lot of elderly people who are made poor by their medical expenses. And that's one of the things they found. So anyway, there's this whole new So you could all now go read the new poverty numbers, which are quite interesting, quite conceptually challenging to think about how they did it.
You have another question?
Oh, it was just a technical question about, so when people are estimating that the living wage would be $11 or $12 an hour, is that based on 2 people working or 1 person working?
No, I think they made the computation the way I did.
Yeah.
The way I made the computation was say the poverty level for a family of 4 is $25,000. So you back out what you need for a wage to achieve that with one
So
worker.
it's one, yeah.
One person, yeah.
Yeah, and living wage calculations are based on the number of members in the household. So if there's 4, then it's a different number, and if there's 10, there's a different number.
Right, but it's the same number if it's 2 adults and 2 children as it is if it's 1 adult and 3 children? Because they're only counting 1 adult as working. Even if
Probably,
there are 2 adults in the house.
yeah.
I don't know the answer to that
Yeah, it
question.
probably doesn't. make
Yeah, because
that
if you had 2 adults in the house, each were earning $10 or $11 an hour, you'd have a $40,000 annual income.
Yeah, and they're well out of the poverty.
Yeah.
And that's another reason for the split, the widening gap, isn't it, between higher and lower income segments? In that higher income families generally have now, or often have now, far greater number of dual wage earners. And lower income families often are more often single family, or single worker families and single parent families.
Oh, well,
than
yeah,
they have been in the past.
The moving part of family income has actually been greater than the moving part of wages because of the family composition issues and what Gary Becker amusingly calls a sort of mating.
Well, I mean,
Meaning
the
high
worst
wage
thing
people
that can
marry high
happen-
wage people.
The worst thing that can happen to a mother and children is a divorce or abandonment. I mean, that's guaranteed poverty. Unless, of course, you're rich, then it's freedom. Any other questions? Well,
I just
yes,
have a small
please.
question for Walter. Do you find that job training doesn't work for any kind of person, or does it work for educated people who are somewhat semi-skilled?
The general finding is that job training, there's 2 things about job training. Number one, for most subgroups people look at, it doesn't work, except possibly for single women. There is a number of studies that found job training has some positive payoff to single women families. So that's kind of an interesting finding. It needs further work. But the other is that job training done in conjunction with other programs sometimes can be more effective.
Especially in conjunction with industries themselves. So
Good.
there's very good evidence that I've been talking about extrusion machines because I'm on the board of trustees at Massachusetts Community College, and we have this whole wing of a building with a huge plastic, wood composite plastic extrusion lab, as it were, to train people to work in the local extrusion industry. And it was paid for in large part by the local industry, helping us to set this up so that we would train workers for a specific industry locally. So very closely a coordinated job training works. It's almost like a business-run apprentice program. That works, but training people more generally for the marketplace, that's a kind of uncertain bet on what skills are going to be demanded. It's very hard, but specific job training for this factory in this town, this community college, those things work.
Were there also issues of not just matching skills to jobs, but also transportation issues, all these complexities of whether people were going to be able to use these new job skills that were part of the problem?
Yeah, we had many problems. People can't get to jobs.
Yeah.
Jobs are located in the suburbs, they're in the city. Big problems. Okay, well, we could go on, obviously. This is a subject that will daunt us all for years and years. Our generation has done actually a little better in the war on poverty than it's made out to be, but nonetheless, not good enough. And it's up to you to pick up the ball and figure out some of these tough problems with the help of You're excellent professors. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.